Hi everyone and welcome to my guide to the Lunging Strike Barbarian in Season 9. This is a super fast, super fun build, and despite the naysayers at the start of the season, it looks like Barbarian is actually doing really well, in particular with this build. I've been playing this on Hardcore, SSF, for the last few days and I had an absolute blast. I'm destroying all the content in Torment 4, and we have seen people push this to beyond Pit 100 on the higher end as well. Personally, I've been doing speed farming in the range of like around tier 80 in like 3 minutes or so with this build so far, and it's not even fully maxed out. So I want to show you what this is all about. There's also a bunch of new developments since the season start, thanks to some bugs and other learnings that we have discovered. So I want to make sure that everyone is up to date on this. But I can only just recommend Barbarian is super fun. The basic buffs are really great. And in particular, Lunging Strike feels amazing because you have this built-in mobility. You can fly through the maps. So especially for speed farming, fast pit runs, Paragon farming, Torment 4 stuff, even Torment 4 lair bosses and Astaroth are no issue at all. I kill them in seconds. And again, this is even on a hardcore BARB where I try to go for a bit more survivability anyway. In general, it definitely looks like Barbarian has caught up with some of the other classes, at least with those builds. There are other builds out there as well. There are other variants of basic attack builds that also have largely the same multipliers and items equipped anyway, so you can even swap it around a little bit if you want to try something else. There's Flay, for example. Then there is Bash, and then a little bit on the weaker side also Frenzy. So you can kind of apply the same knowledge to all of these. While we're at it, I also want to highlight the max roll guide that we have for this. So this is the Lunging Strike Barbarian. I will link this down in the description. I made my own planner, but there are very few moving pieces anyway, so there are some slight tweaks. But if you want to read up on more details, mechanics, and just have a written version of this, then you can also go check this out. But I'll walk you through what I have been doing. So here's my planner. I'll also have this link down in the description. And well, what you need to know is this is a relatively unique, heavy setup because there are like a lot of really powerful, basic and just general damage buffs that you want to go for. So even on kind of like a starter variant, you kind of need a lot of uniques. The biggest one here is the Hooves of the Mountain God. This is a new unique item that now drops in Season 9. You can get this from Beast in the Ice and Urivar, I believe. And this makes your basic attacks cleave. So this is like one of the most important pieces of the puzzle that you want here. And we have the Pain Gorger's Gauntlet. Again, a Beast in the Ice drop. And this is also a very powerful basic attack buff. Previously, Pain Gorger's was bugged to hell and it didn't really echo any kind of important damage multipliers. But a lot of stuff has been fixed, and this has really kind of taken a lot of the basic build up a notch, including this one. So with Pain Gorgers, you try to apply this mark to enemies with non-basic attacks, which can be many things, but in our case, this is the Wolves. So we use the Moni plus Say rune combo here. And like that, while we attack with Lunging Strike, which is tagged mobility, you spawn these Wolves. And they make everything vulnerable, which is nice. We don't have to get that anywhere else. And they freeze everything, so everything is very safe. And their attacks cleave and apply this Pain Gorger's mark. So these two uniques are kind of like the core of the build. You want to have those, and like this you have great AoE coverage, you get the cleave, and you have a good bunch of damage as well already built in. Then another kind of core item here is Rage of Harrogate. A lot of people also ask me about the Shroud of False Death. I don't think this is really such a great idea because you want the cooldown reduction. So you try to get this item here, which is from Grégoire. And like this, you get all the cooldowns all the time, especially in AoE fights. You reset everything in seconds. And even on the boss, once you have good attack speed and you have a decent roll on this unique affix, you can keep up most of your shouts all the time. And even the Wrath of the Berserker, which is a pretty important multiplier. And speaking of that, you see here there's a normal helm, and even the mythic variant runs the Air of Perdition. And we don't run the Ugly Bastard helm. This is because of a bug. Otherwise, we would use it most likely, or it would be at least pretty comparable to this. But right now, when you cast Wrath of the Berserker and it's still active with the Ugly Bastard helm, you will lose the damage buff and the damage conversion. So it's extremely clunky to try to use this because there's no way to track the timer of Wrath of the Berserker in game. It has a 10 seconds duration, but you need to like perfectly cast it after it's over every single time. And this is pretty infeasible in practice. So instead we go for this. And for the starter variant, we have just a normal helm, try to fix your res and armor, for example. Some other big items that go into this build are the 2 unique swords. So Shard of Arathiel for basic attacks, again, a pretty big multiplier and extremely difficult to get. This is a target farm from Infernal Hordes, but it has abysmal drop rate, especially with GAs. And on top of that, it has large ranges on many of its affixes, especially the unique affix. So this is a very elusive item, and can be like the hardest piece to get, at least for me so far. This has been a nightmare. But if you have a good roll, this is really big and you want to include that. And then kind of same story from Radni, but more target farmable from Lord Zier. You get this item here. And we use dual wielding for lunging strike, so we get this multiplier, and we stack a lot of maximum fury. In late game setups, we have over 300 maximum fury, so Ramadni alone is like a times 2.5 or more. And this also synergizes with adaptability aspect, which now also gives you more damage to your basic attacks per resource you have. So this is also an insane multiplier, like a times 4 or so with this amount of fury. I have played this build successfully in Tournament 4, no problem, without any mythics as well. So again, you know, you just try to replace it with other items. So I was running like a normal weapon, a normal ring, and so on. This is not required to be successful in Tournament 4, but it does amp up the build a bit late game. So a Grandfather helps out. It has the double crit damage, and then also really good stats, lots of damage, resource again. And we have also the Starless. And you might be thinking, why do we use the Starless? Because how do we spend resources? Well, this is thanks to the Shard of Arathiel. So it makes your basic attacks actually cost resources, and then you can also trigger Starless. Now there's one important piece here to kind of make the puzzle work with the resource spent and the resource gained. You'll see here that, for example, Lunging Strike now says Fury cost 25, Generate Fury 12, so that doesn't really check out. But on the other hand, you have a lot of resource generation buffs. So for example, there is a Rallying Cry that I can use. This gives you a resource buff. It also gives you like a flat amount of resource when you use it. And we also have, for example, passive regeneration, Fury per second here on the boots. And we also have, for example, Reactive Ooze that also gives you lots of regeneration all the time. So you don't really run out of Fury, but you actually do because of this unique effect here. So when you do your first attack with a basic skill, then you will start draining your resources. It will go faster and faster until you run out of resources. So there's no way to permanently sustain your resources high, but you try to keep it as high as possible for as long as possible because of those multipliers here from the Ramanadni and the adaptability. But you just need to be aware that when you play this build, there will be occasionally, like once every half minute or something like that, like a 1 second downtime where your fury is just 0 and you have to like kind of build it up again in that moment. So in that case, you can press the Rallying Cry if you notice it, but otherwise it also just comes back in really quickly anyway. But there is like this tiny bit of a gap. The other aspects that you have in the build here are Moonrise. So this is just a really nice basic skill buff. It gives you attack speed, movement speed as well, so really neat. And we have the Earthquakes aspect. This is not an Earthquake build. This is just there for another damage buff because of the last lines here where you deal 120% increased damage after standing in Earthquakes for 4 seconds. So like this, we use the Seer plus Tech combo in our other rune setup. Funny enough, all the runes in this build are magic runes, so it's very easy to set up. And like this, occasionally get an Earthquake. The Earthquake does nothing, but it buffs you. And it also gives you damage reduction thanks to the Volcanoes aspect. And before you get the final setup with the Mythics, we also have the Vehement Brawler aspect that gives you extra ranks to your ultimate skill, and you want to cast that often enough anyway, so you usually have this buff up all the time. And we also have Anti-Masters aspect, or this can be even something else like Rapid, for example, if you feel like you need more attack speed and you don't have that yet. And the gameplay of this build is very simple. Again, you have Rage of Harrogate, so you want to reset your cooldowns, and usually every few seconds or so you will press your shouts. You can press Warcry and Challenging Shout together at the same time, but you cannot press Rallying Cry and Challenging Shout together at the same time because they're in the same defensive skills category. They're both here and you can't activate them in the same moment. So Rallying Cry is kind of like the backup in case you're running out of resources or in case you need the Unstoppable when you have downtime of your Wrath of the Berserker, which usually gives you permanent Unstoppable. So I don't really press that very often, but I usually just press Warcry and Challenging together. You get a big damage buff and a big damage reduction buff. And then together with that also Wrath of the Berserker. And they have pretty similar cooldowns. Once you have a bit of Wrath of the Berserker cooldown tempers And like this, you can always activate all of these together. At the very minimum, you want to make sure that you cast these things once every 10 seconds, because without Wrath of the Berserker, you'll lose a lot of your damage. You get the Berserking built in, you get Unstoppable, and then you also have the Warcry damage buff, and you also have this stacking Wrath buff here. As you spend resources while it's up, you deal even more damage. And we also, for example, have Tempers. They're pretty high damage value Tempers, damage while Wrath of the Berserker is active on the offensive slots. So it definitely drops quite a lot when it's down. You want to make sure you cast it every 10 seconds. And additionally, it actually has the bonus effect where it pulls in enemies when you activate it. So it acts a little bit like a rogue's death trap, for example. So you walk into the pack, you press the button, everything flies to you, and you can cleave into the pack. In my case here, we also have the leap. I just love leap, and it makes you go faster. You can jump over cliffs and so on. It just feels good to play. But for example, if you go for like more higher end content, it's also a good idea to go for ground stomp. This also helps, for example, for keeping up your wrath at bosses where you don't get that many targets hit, and Rage of Paragon might be kind of close in resetting your Wrath of Berserker. So it's much easier to keep it up permanently because we have this strategic ground stomp effect here where you get -5 seconds flat on your ultimate cooldown when you use ground stomp. So you can weave that into your rotation every time. Let's go with the skill tree real quick. So it's pretty straightforward. We invest everything into lunge. We get a bunch of built-in healing as well, and you get a built-in bleed. The bleed part doesn't really do that much damage, but it does activate a few modifiers from the Paragons for extra damage and extra damage reduction, which is neat. And it also allows us to, for example, proc this chest here. So this just all comes from the main skill. Other than that, we pick up a lot of damage passives and damage reduction passives. So there's, for example, Warpath here every once in a while. With our higher attack speed, we just get a random overpower. It's not really the strongest passive, so you can take this out. You can get 4 points and redistribute them if you feel like you want something else. But I have it here for the late game setup. But for example, you also want to try to hit 100% crit chance, and this might be a bit tough to get early on, so you can maybe put the points there. Other than that, we have Imposing Presence, Martial Vigor, lots of defense here. You want to have this. We have the Belligerence. This is also something you can temper early on before Grandfather, for example, because we have the Lunging Strike deals double damage temper, but one two-handed temper without even Masterwork critting can be enough to get 100%, and you don't need to have it on other weapons as well. So for example, we put Belligerence here and want to try to Masterwork that up if you don't have the Grandfather yet. So this is pretty neat. We have our shouts here. Then we have a bit of shout synergies, longer durations. There's movement speed. Again, this is something that you could potentially redistribute in the late game. If you have really high movement speed anyway, the cap is plus 100%. You get 15 from Berserking. You have the Perdition Helm, you have the boots. So at some point you can actually take out a few points potentially. We have damage reduction from aggressive resistance, leap. So you just need the cooldown reduction here. You can also go for the 40 Fury, but usually it doesn't really matter. More damage passives all over the board here. And you also have Duelist. Again, this is one of those passives where you can try to min-max your points a little bit, because it is actually possible to reach 100% cap 1 attack speed with just gear, and you don't need those points. This is also cap 1 here. And lastly, Wrath of the Berserker and Unconstrained, which gives us a bigger Berserking damage buff and also a physical damage reduction bonus when we're low HP. But that usually doesn't happen. And here are the Paragons. So it looks like this. We have a Decimator. We get extra damage against vulnerable targets. So this is why it's important to proc vulnerable all the time, which is done through the Wolves. But if you for some reason don't run the Wolves, then you want to make sure you have vulnerable elsewhere, because you get a 20 multi and another 20 from this. Then we have a Blood Rage. It's just 45% multi all the time. Very chill. We get Warbringer, which is free Fortify all the time. Doesn't really help us with more damage, but there's not many other great balls to take. And lastly, we have Weapons Master. We don't really swap weapons, we just take it for the extra damage against injured and healthy. So this also helps a lot to one-shot stuff in Torment 4. For the glyphs, there are a bunch of decent ones, like Ambidextrous gives you the extra one-handed dual-wield damage. We have Undaunted for a bit of damage reduction. We have Challenger, just like an overall decent damage buff. And Wrath, which is probably the most powerful glyph here, and also gives us a bit of Fury back. And then we have kind of like one tech slot here. So for speed farming, I actually kind of like Exploit. This just applies vulnerable instantly on the first hit for 3 seconds, and then usually your wolves are there to do the rest. But you can also swap this out. So for example, when you go for higher tier content, like bossing and pit pushing and so on, I went with Ire, which gives a bit of extra damage reduction, and in a bit slower paced content, you don't rely on this exploit like vulnerable application. So in that case, you can swap the glyph around. If you want to see the Paragon progression, I also have like a Paragon 200 and Paragon 250 board here, so you can see like where you're taking out the points. For example, in order to make this work. For the season powers, you can experiment with this a little bit, but I did find Reactive Ooze pretty nice because of this resource generation effect. I also like Bottled Wind because it gives us a huge barrier pretty often. And we also have the Frigid Heart here, or I can use another control one. The main reason I put this one is here is because of more damage reduction. So when you have the Horadic Crest, you give extra damage reduction and extra maximum all res. Resistances are a bit of a struggle on this barb. So that's also, for example, why in the Ancestral variant early on I have a helm like this with some extra res, just to kind of make that work when you have less Paragons and less Masterworks and so on. But later on, it is relatively easy to cap your resistances. So you have like one roll here and one roll there. And then the rest just comes from like incense and the all stats you get from the grandfather and these kind of things. Then we have the Will Breaker gem here. This is a physical damage gem, so this is also really powerful, especially for farming. And when you get to the point where you just blast down bosses in seconds, you just need to be aware that for the first 6 seconds you have a pretty massive damage buff, and then it falls off a little bit. So for like higher tier pit pushing, or if you're just kind of like barely too weak, for example, to take down a boss in 6 seconds, then it kind of like gets quite a lot longer after that because you lose this damage buff, and only when you stagger them you will reapply this. So keep that in mind. You want to go fast. And here we have kind of like a tech slot. I have the Illuminate Eye for the cooldown reduction, but if you have really good cooldown reduction for your Wrath, you don't really need this. And for example, there's also the attack speed buff here, the Myriad Stone. So especially early on when you don't have good attack speed values, you can run this if your cooldown is good enough. And you want to assign your catalyst to the Wrathful Berserker to make this work. And that's about it for this guide. So I hope you enjoyed this. I had a ton of fun with the Barb so far. This has been one of the most fun Barb playstyles I've actually played. And I'm just glad that it's actually working out pretty well for the class after all. So I can just recommend you guys to try it out and have some fun with this, because it just goes fast, it feels very zoomy, and it's just a ton of fun. So hope you like this. Go check out the Maxwell guide if you want to see some more details. Otherwise, come find me on stream to see me play it, because I'll be blasting on this a bunch more. So hope you like this video, and I'll see you guys next time.